The first night on the streets was the hardest. Amber, a once proud Labrador retriever, lay curled beneath an abandoned truck in a forgotten corner of the city, shivering from the cold seeping into her bones. Rain dripped steadily from the rusted frame above her, pooling into muddy puddles that soaked her golden fur. Her stomach twisted in hunger, but there was nothing left to eat, not even a scrap of discarded food to scavenge. Her ribs were beginning to show beneath her coat, a far cry from the strong, well-fed dog she had once been. She had been a hero, a rescuer, a soldier. Now, she was nothing. She had been trained to save lives, to dig through rubble, crawl into collapsed buildings, and locate the wounded. Her nose had led medics to men buried under fallen walls. Her instincts had saved those who couldn't cry for help. She had worked tirelessly in the war, rewarded with gentle pats, grateful voices, and the silent understanding that her mission mattered. But when the war ended, so did her purpose. Amber was sent back to the States, placed in a program to repurpose military dogs for police work. The officers expected her to attack, chase, subdue, but that wasn't who she was. When a suspect ran, she hesitated. When she was ordered to bite, she froze. She wasn't built for violence. She was a rescuer, not a hunter. The trainers lost patience. The program had no room for a dog that wouldn't obey. One morning, they simply opened the kennel door and let her go. She had waited, confused, expecting someone to call her back. But no one came. Days passed, and hunger gnawed at her insides. She tried approaching people, sensing their kindness beneath layers of indifference, but they waved her away. A man outside a diner had thrown a half-eaten sandwich into the trash, and she had darted toward it, heart-pounding, desperate. But before she could snatch it, another dog, larger, more aggressive, had lunged at her. Teeth flashed. Pain seared through her shoulder as she barely managed to escape. She ran until her paws ached, the city blurring around her. Now, as the rain fell in a slow, merciless rhythm, she curled deeper into herself, longing for warmth, for safety, for someone who still saw her as more than a burden. In the distance, a siren wailed, cutting through the night like an old memory. Amber's ears perked up. She knew that sound. Her body tensed, instincts awakening as she lifted her head. Somewhere out there, someone was in trouble. Somewhere, she was still needed. She just had to find them. This is the opening scene, setting up Amber's loneliness, pain, and longing for purpose. Let me know if you'd like any changes before we move to the next part, fighting for survival. Rocket. Next part. ChatGPT. Amber's last mission. Part 1. Fighting for survival. The hunger never left. It clung to her ribs, gnawed at her belly, turned every waking moment into a desperate search for food. Amber moved through the streets like a shadow, her golden coat now dull and matted with dirt. She had once worn a harness with a badge, now she wore nothing but the weight of loneliness. She had learned quickly that the city was not kind to the weak. On her second night, she had found a pile of discarded food wrappers near a fast food restaurant. The scent of meat and grease sent her scrambling toward it, heart pounding. But before she could reach the scraps, a pack of strays emerged from the darkness. There were 4 of them, lean, scarred survivors. Their eyes locked onto her, and Amber understood the silent warning in their stiff postures. She wasn't welcome. She backed away, her instincts telling her not to fight. These dogs were different from the ones she had known in the military. Those dogs had been her brothers and sisters, trained to work together, to trust one another. These dogs only knew hunger and violence. A deep growl rumbled from the largest of them, a brindle-coated mutt with torn ears. Amber lowered her head and turned, walking away slowly, keeping her posture neutral. She had learned another rule of the streets: don't challenge what you can't beat. But that left her with nothing. No food, no shelter, no home. She wandered for hours, sniffing along sidewalks and alleyways, looking for anything edible. A few times, she found old bones, but they had long since been stripped of anything worth eating. Her paws ached from the endless pavement. She had been trained to work in war zones, on rough terrain, through shattered buildings and open fields, but she had never walked aimlessly. She had always had a destination, a purpose. That purpose was gone. By the 4th night, exhaustion hit her like a wave. She collapsed behind an old warehouse, curling up near the rusted dumpsters. The smell was awful, but at least it was dry. For a moment, she let herself drift into sleep. And that was when the thunder came. A deep, rolling boom shattered the silence, shaking the ground. Amber's body reacted before her mind did, jerking upright, heart pounding, breath coming in rapid gasps. Another crack of thunder, and suddenly she was there again. The smoke-filled battlefield. The shouts of soldiers. the scent of burning metal and gunpowder. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to dig, to find the wounded, to save, but there was no one here. Just an empty alley and a storm tearing through the night sky. Amber tried to calm herself, but her body wouldn't stop shaking. She needed to run. She bolted through the streets, paws splashing through puddles, wind howling around her. She ran until her legs gave out. When she finally stopped, panting, she found herself in front of a building that smelled familiar: ash, smoke, and water. A fire station. The doors were closed for the night, but the air carried the unmistakable scent of firefighters, people who ran toward danger instead of away from it. Amber hesitated. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she belonged here. But was there still a place for her in a world that had already forgotten her? She lowered herself to the cold pavement, curling up beside the station's stone steps. She would wait, because somewhere inside that building, there had to be someone who understood what it meant to carry ghosts. Someone who had lost people too. This chapter intensifies Amber's struggle for survival, her trauma, and her instincts still pulling her toward rescue work. Now, she has reached a fire station, where she will soon meet Thomas Blake, the retired firefighter. Let me know if you'd like any changes before I move on to Part 2, A Chance Encounter. Fire engine fire. Next part. ChatGPT. Amber's last mission. Part 2, A Chance Encounter. Thomas Blake didn't sleep much anymore. Most nights, he sat on the porch of his small apartment across from the fire station, a mug of coffee going cold in his hands. It was always the same routine: watch the station, listen to the sirens, count the ghosts. The fire station had been his second home for almost 30 years. Now, it was just a reminder of what he had lost. A burned apartment complex. A mother and her 2 children trapped on the top floor. A collapsing ceiling. Flames swallowing the stairwell. Thomas reaching out, screaming. He rubbed a hand over his face and took a sip of coffee, forcing the memories back. The fire had been 10 years ago. He had done everything he could. It still wasn't enough. The department had forced him into early retirement after an injury to his shoulder made it impossible for him to carry heavy gear. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a punishment. How do you stop saving people when saving people is the only thing you've ever known? A low movement near the station steps caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another stray dog. The city had plenty of them, tough and scrawny creatures that scoured the streets for scraps. But then he saw the way she held herself. She wasn't like the other strays. She was quiet, still, but not fearful. She lay curled up on the cold pavement, but her eyes remained open, watching the station doors as if she were waiting for a call to action. Thomas frowned and set his mug down, standing with a grunt. His old injuries always ached in the cold, but he ignored them as he made his way down the steps. The dog lifted her head, golden brown eyes locking onto him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with slow, careful movements, he crouched a few feet away from her. "Hey there, girl," he murmured. His voice was rough from years of shouting over flames and sirens. "What are you doing out here?" The dog didn't flinch. She simply watched him, her ears slightly tilted forward, assessing. Thomas took in the details: the faded scars on her legs, the dirt on her coat, the way her ribs pressed against her skin just a little too much. Someone had abandoned her. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I know that look." She blinked slowly, as if she understood. Carefully, he reached out his hand, palm up. She didn't move. "Not ready for that yet, huh?" He didn't push. He knew what it was like to be a broken thing that didn't trust easily. Instead, he shifted back and pulled a granola bar from his jacket pocket. He always carried something, an old habit from firehouse days when you never knew when the next meal would come. He unwrapped the bar and broke off a piece, placing it on the pavement between them. "Here," he said. "It's not much, but it's better than garbage." The dog hesitated. Then, after what felt like forever, she crept forward and took the food. She didn't snatch it, didn't gulp it down in desperation like most strays would. She ate it carefully, almost politely. Thomas felt something in his chest tighten. He had seen this before. Not in dogs, but in people, fire victims, still in shock, taking water from his hands after being pulled from a blaze. Not trusting that it was real, that they were safe, that it wasn't just another cruel trick of fate. He looked at the dog again and saw the same quiet hesitation in her eyes. "I don't think you're just some street mutt," he said softly. "I think you used to belong somewhere." Her tail gave the smallest twitch. He nodded to himself, rubbing a hand over his beard. "All right, Amber, let's get you out of the cold." The name just slipped out. Maybe it was because of the color of her coat, warm like firelight. Maybe it was because she reminded him of the embers that burned long after the flames had died. She didn't move when he stood, didn't move when he turned and started toward his apartment. But when he reached the steps, he heard it, the soft click-click of paws on pavement behind him. Amber was following. And for the first time in years, Thomas wasn't walking home alone. This chapter establishes the first connection between Thomas and Amber, both carrying the weight of past failures and loneliness. Amber chooses to follow him, just as he instinctively chooses to help her. Let me know if this part works for you before I move to part 3, A Fragile Trust. Fire engine fire paw prints. Next part, ChatGPT. Amber's last mission. Part 3, A Fragile Trust. Amber hesitated at the threshold. The open door loomed before her, warm light spilling out into the cold night. She could smell something inside, not food, but a scent even more familiar. Wood smoke, ash, water-soaked fabric. It smelled like fire. Not the burning kind that destroyed, but the kind that stayed behind after the embers died. The scent of someone who had walked through flames and lived to tell the story. Amber's paws stayed rooted to the pavement. She had spent weeks sleeping under trucks and abandoned buildings, hiding from the cold. She had learned that doors usually meant confinement, cages, places where people locked you away until they didn't need you anymore. She didn't want to be trapped again. From inside, Thomas let out a slow breath, watching her carefully. He didn't call her, didn't coax. He just waited. He understood something the police trainers never had. Trust couldn't be forced. It had to be given. Minutes passed. The cold seeped deeper into her bones. The wind cut through her damp fur. Amber's body ached. And she was so tired. With a quiet sigh, she took a step forward. Then another. She crossed the threshold, her body tense, ready to flee if something went wrong. Thomas didn't close the door behind her. He simply nodded and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a faded towel from a chair. "Let's get you cleaned up a little." Amber stood still as he knelt beside her, rubbing the towel over her soaked fur. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor, but gentle. He worked slowly, never forcing, never restraining. When he was done, he tossed the towel into the laundry bin and pointed toward an old blanket near the fireplace. "That's yours if you want it." Amber glanced at him, then at the blanket. She sniffed the edges, circling once before lowering herself onto it. The warmth seeped into her muscles, soothing aches she hadn't realized she was carrying. Thomas sat down heavily in the old recliner across from her, stretching out his bad shoulder with a quiet grunt. "You can stay as long as you want," he muttered. Amber flicked an ear at the sound of his voice, but didn't lift her head. She didn't believe him yet. She had heard promises before, empty reassurances from handlers who said she would be taken care of, only to be discarded when she wasn't useful anymore. But the warmth of the fire felt real. The rough texture of the blanket beneath her paws felt real. The steady breathing of the man across from her felt real. For the first time in weeks, Amber closed her eyes. And this time, she didn't dream of bombs or collapsing buildings. She just slept. Morning came slow and quiet. Thomas woke to the sound of soft footsteps on the wooden floor. He opened his eyes, expecting to see Amber still curled on the blanket, but she wasn't there. His heart lurched. Had she left? Had he misjudged, thinking she would stay? Then he heard it, a faint rustling in the kitchen. He stood, stretching out his stiff muscles, and made his way toward the sound. Amber stood near the small table, nose twitching toward an unopened bag of dog food he had picked up weeks ago on impulse. She wasn't eating. She was waiting. Thomas exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You don't have to ask, you know." He grabbed the bag, pouring some food into a bowl. The dry kibble rattled, and Amber's ears twitched, but she didn't move until he stepped back. Only then did she eat, slowly, cautiously, as if she wasn't sure if the meal was really hers to take. Thomas watched her for a long moment. He knew that feeling. That uncertainty of not knowing if you were allowed to take comfort, if you deserved to be cared for. It was a fragile trust, but it was a start. "You were military, weren't you?" he said, mostly to himself. Amber paused for just a second, then continued eating. Thomas leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Yeah, I know the type." He wasn't talking about dogs anymore. Amber finished her meal and licked her nose, then looked up at him, her golden brown eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was starting to believe she might have a place here. This chapter focuses on Amber's slow acceptance of Thomas and her struggle to trust again. It also highlights how Thomas recognizes himself in her, both of them discarded, both trying to figure out if they still have a purpose. Let me know if this works before I move on to part 4. Instincts Never Die, where Amber's rescue instincts kick in for the first time. Fire engine fire paw prints. Next part. ChatGPT. Amber's last mission. Part 4. Instincts Never Die. Amber wasn't sure when the house started feeling less like a place she was passing through and more like a place she might stay. Maybe it was the warmth of the fireplace at night, the steady rhythm of Thomas's quiet movements. Maybe it was the food, not just scraps, but real meals, placed down for her without hesitation, as if she belonged there. Thomas never forced her to do anything. He spoke to her in that low, steady voice, never expecting a response. He gave her space, let her come and go as she pleased. And little by little, Amber found herself watching him more closely. She was learning him. The way he winced when he lifted his left arm too high. The way he ran a hand over his face when he thought too hard about something he didn't want to remember. The way he stared at the fire late into the night, as if looking for something in the flames he would never find. He carried ghosts. Just like she did. The first time her instincts kicked in again, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fire, or an explosion, or a collapsed building. It was just a sound. Thomas had left early that morning, muttering something about running errands. Amber had watched him go from her spot by the fireplace, ears twitching at the click of the front door. The house was quiet. Then, a cry. Faint, muffled by the walls, but unmistakable. Amber lifted her head, ears straining. Another sound, a child's voice, high and thin, carrying just a little too much fear. Amber was on her feet before she realized she had moved. The door was closed, but a window near the porch was cracked open. She pushed her nose against the frame, shoving it wider. The air outside smelled of damp pavement and winter frost. And something else. Distress. She leapt through the gap, landing lightly on the porch steps. The cry came again, sharper this time. Amber moved. Her paws hit the ground, muscles shifting beneath her coat as she tracked the sound. It wasn't far, just past the station, near the alley behind the old bakery. She found him near a pile of broken pallets, a small boy, maybe 6 or 7, clutching his knee with both hands. His face was scrunched in pain, dirt smeared across his cheeks. Amber slowed as she approached, lowering her head slightly to keep from startling him. The boy's breath hitched as he saw her. He pressed himself against the wall, his small fingers digging into his jeans. Amber stopped a few feet away, letting him decide. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the wind through the alley. Then, hesitantly, the boy lifted one hand toward her. Amber took a slow step forward. His fingers brushed against her fur, tentative, unsure. Then, trusting. The boy exhaled shakily, his shoulders relaxing. I fell, he murmured, glancing at his scraped knee. It hurts. Amber sniffed at the wound. It wasn't deep, but it bled enough to make the child nervous. Without thinking, she did what she had done so many times before. She stayed. She sat beside him, steady and unmoving, letting him lean into her warmth. Somewhere deep in her memory, she recalled the weight of wounded soldiers resting against her as medics worked. She remembered the sound of their ragged breathing, the way they gripped her harness like an anchor. She had been trained for this. She had never forgotten. Thomas found them minutes later. He had been on his way back when he saw the open window, the unmistakable tracks of paws in the dirt. Then the alley. Amber, sitting calmly beside a teary-eyed boy, her presence solid and unwavering. Thomas stopped at the entrance, taking it all in. The way the boy's fingers curled into Amber's fur. The way Amber sat, patient and unbothered, as if this was exactly where she was meant to be. Something unspoken passed through him. He knelt beside them, his voice quiet but steady. Hey, kid. You all right? The boy sniffled but nodded. I fell. He looked down at his knee. It hurt worse before. Thomas glanced at Amber. She didn't move, but her golden brown eyes met his. See? I can still do this. Thomas exhaled slowly. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small first aid kit, another habit from firehouse days he had never been able to shake. As he cleaned the scrape, the boy kept one hand on Amber's fur. She didn't pull away. Thomas worked quickly, taping a bandage over the wound. There. That should hold you together. The boy nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Thomas stood, brushing off his jeans. Where do you live, kid? Just down the street, the boy mumbled. I was supposed to go home, but I cut through here and fell. He looked at Amber, his small hand still resting against her side. She found me. Thomas's throat tightened. She does that, he said gruffly. They walked the boy home. Amber stayed close, matching his steps, her head level with his small shoulders. When his mother answered the door, worry etched into her features, Thomas explained what had happened. She thanked him. Then she bent down, cupping her son's face, her fingers trembling as she checked him over. "You scared me," she whispered. Amber watched them, something flickering behind her eyes. A memory. A soldier, covered in dust and blood, clutching her face between shaking hands. "You found me," he had whispered. "You found me." The door closed, the boys safely inside. Thomas turned to Amber. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he let out a slow, measured breath. "All right," he muttered. "You win." Amber blinked at him. Thomas shook his head, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "You're not just some stray. You were never meant to be a pet." He glanced back toward the alley. "You need a job." Amber tilted her head. Thomas started walking. "Come on, girl." She followed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time in a long time, she had somewhere she needed to be. This chapter marks Amber's turning point, her instincts as a rescuer kicking in for the first time since she was abandoned. It also marks Thomas's realization that Amber isn't just another dog, she's something more, and she needs a purpose just as much as he does. Let me know if this part works before I move on to part 5, a new mission, where Thomas and Amber take their first steps toward becoming a real search and rescue team. Fire engine paw prints fire. Next part. ChatGPT. Amber's last mission. Part 5, a new mission. Amber had saved that boy. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't just that she had found him, it was the way she had done it. No hesitation, no commands, no orders barked at her through a radio. She had simply known. That was instinct. That was training. That was something you couldn't erase, no matter how long a dog had been left to rot. She needed a job. And maybe, just maybe, he did too. The next morning, Thomas made a decision. He dug through his old firehouse gear, shoving past the layers of dust that had settled over things he hadn't touched in years. His hands closed around an old search and rescue harness, stiff with age but still solid. Amber watched from her spot near the fireplace, her golden brown eyes tracking his every movement. "All right, girl," he muttered, brushing off the dust. "Let's see what you remember." The abandoned lot behind the fire station had turned into an unofficial training ground for him over the years. It wasn't much, just an overgrown patch of land with a few scattered piles of wood and debris. But it would do. Thomas led Amber to the center of the lot, the morning air crisp around them. She sat patiently, ears forward, watching. "All right," he said, kneeling in front of her. He held up the harness. "This mean anything to you?" Amber sniffed it. Then, something changed. Her muscles tensed, not in fear, but in recognition. Her eyes sharpened. Her body straightened. She remembered. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He slowly fastened the harness around her, adjusting the straps to fit her lean frame. It wasn't the same as her old military gear, but it would do. Amber didn't flinch. Instead, she stood taller. Like she was slipping into something familiar. Like she was herself again. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped back. "All right, let's see what you got." He started simple. Basic tracking. He walked about 50 feet away, placed one of his old gloves in the tall grass, and returned to her side. Amber's ears twitched, her body already leaning forward, waiting. "Find it," Thomas said. She didn't hesitate. Her nose dropped to the ground, her body moving like a well-oiled machine as she locked onto the scent and followed it with precision. Within seconds, she reached the glove, nosing it before picking it up and trotting back toward him. Thomas exhaled slowly, taking it from her mouth. "That's my girl," he murmured. Amber's tail wagged once. Not much, just a small, tentative movement. But it was something. They spent the rest of the morning testing her abilities. She could track. She could search. She could dig. At one point, Thomas buried a cloth under a pile of loose dirt. The moment he gave the command, Amber was on it. Her paws moved fast, precise, throwing dirt aside as she unearthed the target in record time. Thomas could only stare. How had no one seen this? How had they let a dog like this go? Amber wasn't broken. She had just been waiting for someone who understood her. And Thomas? Maybe he had been waiting too. That night, as Amber curled up by the fireplace, Thomas pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He made a call. A familiar voice answered on the second ring. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again, Blake." Thomas rubbed a hand over his face. "Yeah, well, got something you need to see." There was a pause. Then, "You're not getting back in the game, are you?" Thomas glanced at Amber, already half asleep but still listening, still aware. He thought about the weight in his chest, the years of helplessness, the ghosts of lives he couldn't save. Maybe he couldn't fight fires anymore. Maybe he couldn't carry people out of burning buildings. But maybe he could still save someone. Not alone. Not anymore. Just come by, Thomas said. I think I found us a rescue dog. Amber's tail thumped against the floor, as if she already knew. This chapter marks the true beginning of Amber and Thomas's journey as a search and rescue team. Let me know if this part works before I move to part 6, Proving Themselves, where they get their first real test. Fire engine paw prints fire. Next part, ChatGPT. Amber's last mission. Part 6, Proving Themselves. Thomas had expected pushback. When he walked into the old firehouse the next morning, Amber at his side, he could already hear the skepticism before anyone even spoke. Blake. The voice came from across the room, Chief Ryan Calloway, standing near a rack of turnout gear, arms crossed. He was still built like the firefighter he had once been, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, but the streaks of gray in his beard gave away the years they had all put in. What the hell are you doing here? Calloway asked, his tone not unkind, just curious. Thomas adjusted his grip on Amber's leash. Got something you need to see. Calloway's gaze flicked down. Amber sat beside Thomas, still and alert, her golden brown eyes scanning the room. What am I looking at? Calloway asked. Search and rescue dog, Thomas said simply. Calloway let out a slow breath. Blake, he hesitated. You sure about this? Thomas met his gaze. Yeah. A long pause. Then Calloway sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. All right, he said. Prove it. They took Amber to the training field behind the station. It was nothing fancy, just an old lot filled with wrecked cars, piles of debris, and a few abandoned buildings set up to mimic real disaster zones. A few other firefighters had gathered to watch, murmuring among themselves. Some of them had worked with search dogs before, but none of them had ever seen a dog that had been thrown away. Calloway gave a short nod. All right, we'll run a standard test. Lost person drill. One of our guys is already hiding out there. He pointed to the rubble pile near the far end of the field. Your dog finds him. You're in. She fails. You go home. Thomas exhaled, then crouched beside Amber, unfastening her leash. Her muscles were already tight with anticipation, her ears locked forward. She could smell it. The test wasn't real, but to Amber, it was a mission. Thomas met her eyes. You know what to do, he murmured. Amber didn't need another word. She was gone. She moved like a ghost, her body weaving through wreckage, her nose working the air. Thomas had seen military search and rescue dogs work before. He had watched them clear buildings, dig through debris, track people trapped under collapsed structures. Amber moved just like them, but faster. She wasn't just trained for this. She was born for it. She covered the area in precise, calculated sweeps, cutting through the field with laser focus. The firefighters watching had gone quiet. Even Calloway was watching now, arms still crossed, but his jaw tight. Amber reached the rubble pile in under a minute. She paused, nose working the ground, then froze. Thomas saw the moment she caught the scent. She moved, quick, decisive, paused digging through dirt and debris. Within seconds, she was barking. A firefighter, one of the younger guys, maybe mid-20s, pushed aside a wooden beam and sat up, grinning. Damn, he muttered, dusting off his jacket. That was fast. Amber wagged her tail once but didn't move. She was waiting for Thomas. He let out a slow breath, walking toward her. She did it, one of the firefighters muttered. No hesitation, another said. Calloway exhaled through his nose. Not bad. Thomas scratched behind Amber's ears, his fingers brushing over the harness straps. Told you, he murmured. Amber leaned into his touch, just slightly. She had done her job. And for the first time in years, so had he. They went inside after that. Calloway led them to his office, where he sank into his chair with a deep sigh. You know, he said, rubbing his temples, when I heard you wanted back in, I thought you were out of your damn mind. Thomas smirked. Still might be. Calloway snorted. Yeah, well, you're lucky that dog of yours is better than half the rookies we get these days. He studied Amber, who sat quietly by Thomas's chair, her body relaxed but ready. What's her story? Calloway asked. Thomas's jaw tightened. Military. Search and rescue. War dog. Calloway's expression shifted slightly. Jesus, he muttered. And they just let her go? Thomas looked at Amber. She wasn't watching them, she was watching the fire station doors, ears twitching at every distant siren. Still waiting. Still ready. They didn't know what they had, Thomas said quietly. Calloway nodded, then leaned back in his chair, considering. You want in? He asked. You and her? You really want this? Thomas didn't hesitate. Yeah. 𝐥𝐤𝐤 exhaled, then reached for a stack of forms in his desk drawer. "All right," he muttered. "Let's make it official." Amber's tail thumped once against the floor. She wasn't just a stray anymore. She wasn't lost. She wasn't broken. She had a mission. And this time, no one was taking it away from her. This chapter marks Amber's official return to search and rescue work, as well as Thomas finding his own purpose again. Let me know if this part works before I move on to part 7, the first real call, where Amber and Thomas will face their first real emergency together. Fire engine fire paw prints. Next part. ChatGPT. Amber's last mission. Part 7. The first real call. The first real call came just 3 days later. Thomas had just finished filling out more paperwork than he ever wanted to see again when the alarm blared through the station. Dispatch crackled over the speakers. Collapse reported at an old residential site on Lawson Street. Multiple people unaccounted for. Thomas's gut tightened. Lawson Street. He knew that area. Half the buildings were condemned, set for demolition, but people still squatted in them. The captain on shift barked orders, firefighters rushing to gear up. Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Amber's harness from the locker, turning to where she sat by the door, already alert. Her ears were up. Her body was still. She knew. Thomas knelt, fastening the harness over her shoulders. "You ready, girl?" Amber didn't need to answer. She was already moving before he finished clipping the last strap. The ride to the scene was tense. The fire truck rumbled through the streets, sirens blaring, the weight of urgency pressing against them like a second skin. Amber sat at Thomas's feet, her body steady despite the swaying of the truck. She had done this before. She had ridden toward disaster, toward danger, and she had never run from it. Neither had Thomas. But this was different. The last time he had run towards something like this, he had walked away feeling like he'd failed. He tightened his grip on Amber's harness. Not this time. The scene was chaos. A 2-story building, or what was left of it, sat in a pile of shattered brick and crumbling wood. Smoke curled from somewhere deep inside the wreckage, the scent of burnt insulation mixing with dust in the cold night air. Firefighters were already moving, clearing debris, scanning for signs of survivors. Thomas and Amber jumped down from the truck, stepping into the wreckage. 𝐥𝐤𝐤 met them near the perimeter. 3 people unaccounted for, he said quickly. Neighbors think squatters were inside when it collapsed. Thomas nodded. Let her work. 𝐥𝐤𝐤 hesitated. Then a single nod. Thomas turned to Amber and unhooked her leash. Find them. Amber launched forward. She moved like a bullet, weaving through fallen beams, her nose working fast. Thomas followed, keeping his distance, letting her lead. This was her world. Within seconds, she froze. Her body went stiff, nose pressed against a slab of collapsed ceiling. Then she barked sharp, urgent. Thomas's heart pounded. She had something. Here, he shouted. She's got a hit. Firefighters swarmed the area, working fast. Hands grabbed at debris, lifting chunks of wood and drywall. Then, a voice. Faint, barely there, but unmistakable. A woman's voice. Oh God. I'm here. Amber barked again, tail high, shifting anxiously as if urging them to hurry. Thomas knelt beside her, pressing a hand to her side. Good girl, he murmured. They weren't done yet. The woman was pulled out minutes later, coughing but alive. 2 more missing, 𝐥𝐤𝐤 reminded them, sweat on his brow. Can she go again? Thomas didn't need to ask. Amber was already moving. She circled the debris, scanning, searching. Then as she stopped cold, her ears flattened, her body tense. Something was wrong. Thomas took a step closer. Amber. Then, a shift. The ground beneath them trembled. Thomas barely had time to register it before the remaining part of the structure groaned and started to give. Move, someone shouted. Amber didn't run. She lunged. Straight toward the wreckage, toward the danger, toward whatever she had sensed beneath it. Thomas's chest went tight. Amber. But it was too late. The rubble collapsed around her. And Amber disappeared. This chapter brings Amber and Thomas into real danger, showing that their work isn't just about proving themselves. It's life or death. Let me know if this part works before I move on to part 8, Buried Alive, where we find out if Amber survives. Fire engine fire paw prints. Next part. ChatGPT. Amber's last mission. Part 8, Buried Alive. Thomas didn't remember moving. 1 second, Amber had been there. The next, she was gone. The world narrowed. Sound blurred. Everything except the chaos in front of him turned to static. Amber. His voice ripped through the night, raw and desperate. The wreckage had swallowed her whole, a cascade of collapsing beams and debris burying her beneath tons of broken wood and shattered concrete. She had gone after something. Someone. She had known there was still a life under there. And now she was trapped. Thomas surged forward, hands clawing at the rubble, but Calloway's grip slammed onto his shoulder. "Stop. It's not stable." Thomas turned on him, rage burning hot in his chest. "She's under there." Calloway didn't back down. "And if you go in blind, you'll get buried too." Thomas's breathing was harsh, his hands shaking. The wreckage in front of him blurred, turning into something else. Another collapse. Another call. Flames instead of dust. Screams instead of silence. A mother and her 2 kids trapped. A ceiling caving in before he could reach them. "Not again. Not again. Blake." Calloway's voice was sharp, bringing him back. "We do this right. We get her out." Thomas forced air into his lungs. Focus. Amber was still alive. She had to be. And if she was alive, she was waiting for him to find her. The team moved fast. Firefighters secured the perimeter, checking for weak points. A rescue crew scanned the rubble with thermal cameras, but the layers of debris made it impossible to get a clear reading. "She's too deep," one of the techs muttered. "We need a signal." Thomas swallowed hard, dropping to his knees beside the pile of wreckage. He pressed his hand to the debris. Listened. Nothing. "Come on, girl." Then a sound. Faint. Muffled. A single bark. Thomas's throat tightened. She was alive. "She's still in there," he shouted. "We need a tunnel fast." Calloway didn't hesitate. "You heard him. Get to work." Shovels hit debris. Hands tore through splintered wood. The firefighters moved like a machine, clearing a narrow path. Minutes felt like hours. Dust choked the air, sweat dripping from every brow. Then a flash of movement. Golden fur. Thomas nearly collapsed with relief. "Easy," he muttered, throat tight as he cleared the last chunk of debris. "I got you, girl." Amber was trapped under a broken beam, her body pinned. But she was breathing. Her eyes locked onto his. She had never doubted he would come. Thomas worked fast, hands steady despite the fear still thrumming through his chest. "Hold on, girl. We're getting you out." The moment the weight lifted, Amber pushed forward, but not toward him. Thomas barely had time to react before she dove back into the rubble. "What the hell, eh?" Then he saw it. Amber wasn't just running. She was digging. And seconds later, a hand appeared. Thomas's breath caught. There, beneath the debris, was a boy. The silence that followed was thick with shock. Amber backed up, panting hard but still standing guard over the child. Thomas lunged forward, fingers pressing against the boy's neck. Pulse. "We got him," he roared. The firefighters moved fast, extracting the child with practiced precision. Medics swarmed in, checking vitals. Amber stood still, her chest heaving, dust coating her golden fur. Thomas reached for her, his fingers brushing over the strap of her harness. "You crazy, reckless dog," he murmured, voice hoarse. "You did it." Amber's tail gave the faintest wag. She had never doubted herself. She had never stopped searching. And she had never stopped saving lives. Later, after the boy was safely loaded into an ambulance, after the last flames had been put out, Thomas and Amber sat on the back of the fire truck. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. She leaned against him, her body warm, solid, alive. Thomas let out a slow, measured breath, his hand resting lightly on her back. "You belong here," he murmured. Amber's golden brown eyes flicked up to meet his. "I know. This chapter is a turning point. Amber proves beyond a doubt that she is still a rescuer, and Thomas realizes he never truly lost his purpose. Let me know if this works before I move on to Part 9, A Hero's Recognition, where Amber and Thomas receive the recognition they deserve. Fire Engine Fire Paw Prints. Next part. ChatGPT. Amber's Last Mission. Part 9, A Hero's Recognition. The story spread faster than Thomas expected. By the time they returned to the station, the news was already circulating through local channels, a retired firefighter and his rescue dog saving a child from a collapsed building. Someone had recorded it. The footage showed Amber emerging from the wreckage, covered in dust, tail wagging weakly, standing protectively over the unconscious boy she had found. The image had gone viral overnight. Thomas didn't care about the attention. But Amber? She deserved it. She had spent too long being forgotten. Not anymore. The next morning, the firehouse was buzzing. Firefighters clapped Thomas on the back. They bent down to ruffle Amber's ears, murmuring things like, "Hell of a dog you got there," and "She's the real deal." Even Calloway, usually as emotionally expressive as a brick wall, grunted his approval. Did good, Blake. Thomas just nodded. He didn't say what he was thinking. It wasn't me. It was her. Amber took the attention in stride. She moved through the station with quiet confidence, tail wagging slightly whenever someone reached out to her. She had never been the type to soak up praise. She didn't need a medal or applause. She just needed a mission. But still, for the first time, people saw her for what she really was. Not a stray. Not a discarded tool. A hero. That afternoon, they got a visit. A woman in a dark blue suit stepped into the station, scanning the room with sharp, knowing eyes. Calloway muttered, "Oh," under his breath. Government type. Thomas frowned as she approached. She wasn't military, but she carried herself like someone who worked with them. "Thomas Blake?" she asked, holding out a hand. Thomas shook it warily. "That's me. And this must be Amber." She glanced down at the dog sitting at his feet. Amber stared back at her, unimpressed. The woman smiled slightly. "I'm Emily Hart, Department of Homeland Security." Thomas's shoulders stiffened. "Not interested in whatever you're selling." Hart smirked. "I'm not selling anything. I'm here because of her." She crouched slightly, letting Amber sniff her hand. The military lost a damn good search dog when they let her go. Thomas exhaled sharply. "Tell me something I don't know." Hart straightened. "We're putting together a new civilian-based search and rescue division. Former first responders, veterans, dogs with specialized training. Amber fits the bill." Thomas folded his arms. "You want to take her?" Hart's expression softened. "No, I want you both." Silence stretched between them. Thomas glanced at Amber. She was watching him, waiting just like she had always done. He thought about the wreckage. The boy. The way she had thrown herself into danger without hesitation, because that's who she was. Amber didn't need a quiet retirement. She needed to keep saving lives. And maybe, so did he. Thomas looked back at Hart. What's the next step? That night, Thomas sat on his porch, watching the stars. Amber lay beside him, her head resting on her paws, golden fur glowing in the porch light. "So," he muttered, running a hand down her back. "Guess we're not done yet." Amber huffed softly, as if to say, "Of course not." Thomas smirked. They weren't just a man and a dog anymore. They were a team with a future. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas wasn't just surviving. He was living. And Amber? She was finally home. Epilogue. Some dogs are born to save lives. A year later, they were legends. Thomas and Amber had responded to disasters across the country: hurricanes, collapsed buildings, missing persons. Amber had found people no one else could. She had pulled survivors from wreckage, guided lost hikers back to safety, stood beside Thomas through fire and storm. Reporters called her a hero. Thomas just called her his partner. But every once in a while, when no one was watching, he would scratch behind her ears and whisper, "You saved me too, girl." And Amber? She already knew.